So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining our webinar. We're really pleased to be joined by Will Rainey, who is an actuary by trade. He is also the author of Grandpa's Fortune Fables, which is a book that tries to help children become more financially literate and emotionally resilient. So if you're here to pick up some lessons in terms of how to teach children about money, how to invest for your children, then you're definitely in the right place. The webinar will be recorded, so it can be shared with friends and family later. For questions and answers, there's a Q&A button, which you should be able to find towards the bottom of your screen. So as we go through, if you please just drop in the questions and answers. We'll drop in the questions there, and hopefully with Will, we'll be able to give you some strong answers. So if we just start with a little background, Will. I know we were talking earlier, but I think you started out working in finance. I think as an actuary, which my understanding of that is just it's an accountant and then times 10. And then I understand that you moved with your family to Hong Kong first before moving to Thailand, and then on that adventure you've been teaching your own children some really important money lessons. Can we kind of go through your background?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, so I worked in the financial services industry. So I was an investment consultant, but for institutions. So I was advising like retirement schemes, so defined benefit schemes on where they should put their money. And then when I moved to Hong Kong in 2014, I was like the head of investment strategy for my firm and got to talk to many different institutions. So this was retirement schemes, but also insurance, and even got to talk to some finance ministers around Asia about where to sort of put their money in terms of their investments. And so that was really, really good. Then in 2000, I think it's around 2017, I was just talking to actually one of my clients at the time, and it was a kind of casual conversation about family. And so I've got two young daughters. And so they said to them at the end of the conversation, they just said a flippant comment, which was, enjoy this time with them. They only grow up once, which is a clearly obvious statement, but it had a really big impact on me. And it's like, yeah, and clearly I had a kind of busiest job. And so I wanted to make a bit of a change. And I thought, right, I'm going to spend more of my time with my kids. So I talked to my wife about, let's take some time off the corporate world. And it took me a little bit of time to convince her, but exactly what we did in 2019. We left our corporate jobs in Hong Kong and then actually moved from Hong Kong to a place called Hoi An in Vietnam. It's one of the most beautiful places in the world in my mind. It's got rice fields and it's near the sea, beautiful food and super cheap. But it had a good international school for the kids. And it was really whilst I was there. So I had no real intention. It was just more to spend time with the kids. But I wanted to have a project whilst they were at school. And when I kind of looked back and went, what's my project going to be? But what really stuck in my mind was when I left Hong Kong, quite a lot of people in my financial services industry had said to me, how can you afford to take time off work? How can you not work and sort of have your kids in school and all this? And I thought it was quite strange because we've been kind of saving and investing for the longest time. And so we had that knowledge because of my job and background, but also all of my peers and clients also had that knowledge. So I was like, why aren't they doing that? And a lot of it came down to that my parents were savers and investors and my wife's parents were savers and investors. So we've just naturally been savers and investors. Whereas most other people never got taught about money. Even if they knew about it, they kind of formed these kind of habits. So yeah, so I was like, right, I'm going to make sure that my children learn about money. And so that became my kind of passion project. So when I was putting them to bed, I would sort of tell them a story, but try and have a money lesson to it. And then that started my business, which is Blue Tree Savings, where I shared essentially the stories in the blog forms. And then after a while, yeah, as you mentioned, I have written a book, Grandpa's Fortune Fables. So yeah, that's kind of where I've got to. And then we moved from Vietnam to Thailand last year.
So the blog, the Blue Tree Savings blog, like became like turned into Grandpa's Fortune Fables.
Yeah, no, exactly. I'm an actuary by background, so I'm a numbers guy. So the fact that I started writing, I just tried to do it to see how to try and share what I was doing with my kids, never thinking it would be much. But then some of my blogs got picked up by the likes of the Financial Times. But in the blogs, I would share how I'm teaching my daughters about money. And I said I was using these stories. And after a while, someone's like, well, you've got a number of these stories. Why you should put that into a book? Because most of my work was going directly to the parents, empowering the parents to teach their kids. And I never had anything directly for the children. And so, yeah, people are saying, well, can you just take those stories, which we read to our kids, but via the blog, can you just put them in a book? And so, yeah, the book came out of sort of, it wasn't a plan for the book initially. It just kind of happened that I had these stories. But now, yeah, I'm going to probably write another book because I've continued doing the blog and got new stories. And as I've been doing them, sort of drip feeding the stories, you get a sense of which stories people are really enjoying. So subsequent to writing the book, there's a blog that I did called The Dragon That Pooped Too Much, a story. And it's actually about cars and buying your first car, and the poop is like the expenses. And my daughters loved it. And then I did it as a blog, and it's been one of my most popular blogs. So yeah, clearly I'm going to write another book. It's going to have that story in there.
So the dragon that pooped too much, and the poop is just recognizing that. Well, it's almost like total cost of ownership, right? You buy the car, but actually you've got to consider total cost of ownership over time.
Yeah, so essentially the story is it's got these two sort of 16, 17-year-olds, and they get to an age where they can get their first dragons. And so one gets this big fancy dragon, which is huge and breathes fire, and the other one goes for a more conservative one. And so clearly one, the big dragon, loves it and shows off everything, but then after a time gets a bit frustrated because it's bigger, so it just poops everywhere, which is clearly the big expenses that come with a fancy car, the insurance, the maintenance, the upkeep. And soon it's not enjoying flying around so much, but because it has to shovel so much poo to clear up the mess that the big one carries. So again, it's kind of a fun story, but a nice analogy to sort of a money lesson.
And one of the things I've seen that you've done more recently is launch a podcast, which I think again is sharing these stories. How's that going?
Yeah, no, it's going to. I've only released 2 episodes. The next one's tomorrow. But as I've been creating, so the stories that I share with my daughters are largely, I've either taken a children's story and then tried to apply a money lesson. So a bit like the dragon that pooped too much. I kind of thought the dragon would be quite interesting. How can I make a lesson out of it? But a lot of them are also kind of real world lessons or stories that I've heard about real people or real companies, and then converted those into stories with characters that are a bit more fun. So, for example, the first podcast episode I did was about Samuel Brannan, who was the person who got the richest or most money during the American gold rush in the mid 1800s, but he never found any gold. He actually just told everyone that there's loads of gold. They all came rushing, and he'd just stockpiled all of the shovels and essentially sold these shovels at a hugely inflated price, because people were like, well, we're going to be rich when we find all this gold. But clearly there was never as much gold as he told everyone. So he became super wealthy. And so that story is one of the stories in the book, but I've used different characters and made it a bit more fun language for children. So I wanted to kind of share those real world stories. I thought that they're really interesting to me, and they'll be interesting to hopefully parents, but also, even if it's not for parents, just for adults alike, to try and find interesting ways to hear these stories, but also have these lessons that come from the stories. Because yeah, I'm a big believer that we remember and react and feel emotional about stories rather than being lectured, especially about money, which is sometimes a bit arbitrary and a bit dry as a subject without those kind of stories.
Yeah, I mean, I did listen to that podcast episode, and as you said, that's kind of one of the opening stories in the book, when they're starting to learn about Grandpa and his adventures. And when I guess the key lesson from that particular story is around, let's call it vigilance. You know, so Samuel was like my impression of him, a bit of a con artist, really. I think there's even a part in his story where he plants gold, you know, to try and give people more hope, so then they can buy more of his spades and shovels, where he's making extortionate profits. So if that lesson is around, if it sounds too good to be true, it usually is. What are some of the other kind of key lessons that you think are some of the most important ones that you've taught your daughters and others through the book and the blog?
Yeah, so a lot of the stories that I share and go back to a lot is what I call the three rules of wealth, which I share in the blog. So essentially the three rules of wealth are, most people have probably heard of them in some form or another, but the first rule is just essentially spend less than you earn. So essentially save some money. The second rule is invest what you save. And then the third rule is be patient. But clearly that's obvious in terms of they sound like sensible rules, but I don't know, 90% of adults today do not follow those rules. And so, when you look at it, why don't people follow those rules? They sound very sensible rules. But why don't people? And a lot of that comes down to conditioning and behaviors and habits. We all want to do that, but the world is kind of set up against us. The world is out there to say, so think about companies all around the world. They're spending millions, collectively billions, on marketing to try and get us to not keep our money and not follow those rules. Those companies do not want, so they don't know how our brains work. They know that we care about scarcity, they care about authority, we care about keeping up with the Joneses and impressing other people. They know all this stuff, and they know that's how we can get us to spend our money. So you've got this billions being spent and no real training. And so I was really keen to make sure that my daughters and as many children as possible grow up with the right behaviors or habits, as I call them, that mean that they're kind of protected. As long as they maintain those habits, and they're much less likely to be persuaded by this marketing. And so in lots of my blogs and the whole book is essentially predicated on how do you teach those kids about those three rules of wealth. So I use this analogy throughout blogs and my book, is trying to get kids to think of money like seeds. And so straight away it makes it a bit more interesting, and they can start to say, well, okay, you can give those seeds away and that's just like spending. But straight away kids are then going, oh, what does it mean when you plant them? Because they've now got this other form of money. What's going on here? And they're actually quite curious. And so you can say, well, you can plant those seeds and they'll grow into trees. And over time, those trees will produce more seeds and you can plant them. And over time, if you keep doing that a little bit, you'll have this whole forest. And so kids can kind of visualize this money, and they're starting to see it in a much more fun, visual way. And they're starting to think, oh, actually, I want this forest. It sounds like a good thing that I want. And it helps them see money into the future. It helps them think about looking after their money because they care about the environment and they care about these trees. And they can learn about compound interest, as in the one tree produces seeds. But it covers those three rules of wealth that I mentioned. So clearly, if they get some seeds, they want to try and keep at least one out of every 10. So they can give away most, but they're going to plant one. So again, that's an easy bit. And if they plant that's like investing. So that's going to make that seed grow, because if you put the seeds under the bed, which is putting it into a bank or just literally keeping it into cash, then they're going to see that grow. But clearly a tree doesn't grow overnight. It takes time, i.e. that's the third rule, should be patient. And so over time, just by thinking about this forest and growing it, they're learning these three rules. And if they can put that into practice every single time they get some money, then they're going to have this financial forest. And as I say, most people, sadly today, most people don't have a single tree, let alone a forest. So if they can start early. But the key bit is there's some research that shows that children form many of their adult money behaviors by the age of 7, which when I first heard about this kind of blew my mind. I was like, I couldn't remember thinking about money at the age of 7. But it goes back to how children think about money. When you're growing up, you're kind of just observing. You're seeing what your parents do. You kind of see what's on TV, etc. And most of that is just about spending. So money, spending. So you can think when children get money, most adults will say to them, say for their birthday, for example, they'll say, what are you going to go and spend that money on? What are you going to buy? And again, it's just hardwiring their like really malleable brains at that time to say, oh, money, spending, money, spending, money, spending. And at some point, as they grow up, they learn about this concept of saving. And then they've got to try and rewire the brain to try and save. And the longer it takes before you kind of introduce that concept, the harder it is to rewire. And as we know, as adults, trying to change any habits that we have is really, really challenging. And so if we can just get children at a young age to learn about money and learn about these kind of following these 3 rules of wealth from a youngest age, they're just going to do that as adults. And people say, oh, how come you save? They'll just be like, well, that's just what I've always done. I've learned that every time I got some money, I saved just a little bit of it. So yeah, so they're the 3 kind of rules. And I've got different stories that kind of talk about how to save 1 out of every 10, and one about how to invest, and one about being patient. And then I kind of reinforce this during different subjects that I write about on my blog.
Yeah, I think that those 3 rules are really powerful, Will, and I think the way that you use the analogy of seeds is a really good way of explaining it, and much more easy for children to understand. And I also think it's interesting what you're saying about the behaviors that we form, and you're absolutely right. It's all geared up to spend the money rather than save and invest it. And it made me think, I know one of the other big concepts you talk about is this idea of having a rich life and having a wealthy life and being wealthy. And I think that's another one where there's these sort of behaviors and sort of misconceptions probably when you're younger about being rich or being wealthy. So it'd be really good just to understand a bit about how you articulate that to children.
Yeah, no, it's a really important subject. And I think I remember when I was growing up, I used to watch a program called MTV Cribs. So I used to just go around, but go through like the pop stars or the movie stars' house, and they would have like 6 cars and 50 bedrooms and these swimming pools and have these parties. And I was like, oh, that looks amazing. And I can't remember, I was watching some kind of documentary. I think it was about like MC Hammer or something like that. And he was one of the big ones. And he had like gold toilets and stuff like this. But then he essentially lost all his money. And it was all, he lost his house because he just kept spending and spending and spending. And then I looked in, there's other stories of these pop stars who are on this program. They actually borrowed the house. They just wanted to give off the impression they had these big houses, but they didn't own them. They were just borrowing them for the show. And so it really gave off, okay, these people don't actually have that as much money as they're giving off. And I was a bit, all right, that's a bit strange. Why are they doing that? And it's just that they had the money, but they just spent it. And that's what I kind of call rich, where you have people who have money, but they kind of spend it all. And I say, if you have $1 million and you spend $1 million, you've got 0, you haven't got anything. And I think that's something that I really wanted to get across to my kids, of just because people are spending money doesn't mean they have money. And whereas actually the people who do have money are probably not spending most of it. They're probably spending some of it. But it's those who have this forest that we kind of talked about, and you don't get to see anyone's forest. So wealth and people who have money, you just can't see it. So therefore, you can't just judge someone based on what they're spending. And in fact, if someone is spending a lot, it probably might mean that they have less money than you think. And I think that kind of concept between rich and wealthy. So in the book, actually, I've got these 2 characters. So you've got Grandpa, who's the main character, and they've got this other character called Richie Raccoon, who's just like the MTV Cribs kind of character. He has all the nice clothes to start with, and he goes on his holidays, and everyone's like, oh, I really want to be like Richie Raccoon. But as soon he has a bit of unfortunate luck, and he soon finds out he's lost, he doesn't have any savings, so he's in a bit of a predicament. And then he meets Grandpa, and Grandpa helps him out and sort of helps him grow this kind of forest. But what I was trying to do with the story and the book at large is to show that there's 2 characters. There's these 2, there's this rich character, but there's also this wealthy character, because in the real world, we don't ever get to see those 2 characters. We only get to see the Richie Raccoons and their nice clothes and the nice bits. We don't get to see the grandpas who do have these this wealth and the money and the savings and the emergency funds in there. And so once children see the 2 characters, or read about them in this case, and then you say, which one do you want to be like? They much more likely want to be like the wealthy character. But if they don't have the 2 options and they only ever see one, they'll just aspire to be the rich character. So that's why I feel it's so important, especially probably for children sort of early to late teens, because they're so impressionable. They care so much about their friends and the peer pressure. So to have that conversation about that there's 2 different types of people when it comes to money. There's these people who have money and spend it and have really nice things, but they don't really have much savings. And then you've got these wealthy who do spend, but they focus on making sure they're growing their forest. And my kids do it sometimes. They'll be like, oh, our friends have got something very nice compared to us. And we'll be like, yeah, but do you know how many, we're fortunate we've got this, our little our forest. They might not have a forest. And they're like, and then you say, well, would you rather have that and no forest, or have what we have, which we value, and the forest? And yeah, again, they can understand where we're going from. But it's so important, because as I mentioned, it's money's invisible, or wealth is invisible. And so we need to be proactive as parents or guardians to shine a light on those who do.
I think you kind of hit on one of the big challenges for the first rule, Will. So, if the first rule is spend less than you earn, so if you're getting 10 seeds, plant at least one, ideally two. Like back in the 50s or 60s, like money was much more physical. I think people literally had glass jars for the different areas of their life where they'd spend the money on. So you literally could see like a physical manifestation of those seeds.
Yeah.
How do you overcome that kind of the fact that money is just invisible these days when teaching your children about money?
Yeah, so it's a great question, a great topic, because it brings to my mind that it's now more important than ever for parents to teach their kids about money, because it is becoming invisible. And it's also becoming quite confusing as well, because kids have got money or digital money on random computer games. So that's not real money, but it looks like real money to them. And then they've got another screen on an app or on their computer, which has got real money, but they're not quite sure of the difference between the two. And there's loads of stories now of children spending loads of money on like Roblox, thinking, oh, I didn't realize it was real money that I was spending, because it's just a number on a screen with some kind of random currency on there. So we need to be more proactive than ever. And so what I do with my kids, and I recommend others, is to try and still make it as tangible as possible. And that doesn't necessarily mean using cash that we have, because I know most people don't have much cash in the house, and especially having it in the right denominations. And because I remember we tried to do it with real money before, but then I think we got a pizza takeaway and we didn't have any money for a tip, so we just raided their piggy banks to give that to do that, and but then so then we just put in IOUs, and then we just got rid of cash altogether and just essentially have an IOU system in our house. So when we give our kids pocket money, we essentially have, I don't know, Rainey currency, which has different denominations. And so we still give that to them, and they still have these little boxes which have the money in it, and they split it up into what they want to spend now, what they want to save up for, and what they want to put for the long term, i.e. grow their forests. And then when they want to spend their money, they just give us these little tokens that we've created and essentially cut out of paper or cardboard. And then they give that back to us, and then we go to the shops and buy it. But the thing about that is they're learning, they're seeing the money, even though it's this kind of fake currency that we've created, but they also see it as a transaction. And this was one of the really important lessons about cash that we all take for granted because we grew up with cash, is that when we go to the shops, we want a loaf of bread, as an example, we hand over the cash and we get the bread. And we take that simple transaction so for granted because it's just what we've always seen. But now you go to the shops, you put the bread on the counter and you just wave your watch or your phone or your wallet or whatever it is. And it's like they hear this magical beep, and now you own, they've not seen anything disappear. They've not seen any money go. And they've just had this magic tap and suddenly it's yours. And we take it for granted that they'll know that a transaction, but they don't. There's lots of children who have no idea that money has just gone out of your bank account into the shop's bank account. And so we need to do whatever we can to replace those lessons. So again, doing something at home with just bits of cardboard and having your own currency allows you to still replicate transactions. It helps them see that they have to give up something that was theirs. And they can count out how much they've got left. They have to count out how much they need to give to me when I'm going to buy it on my card. And again, that's so many little lessons in there. So again, you've probably done the same as I have. Gone to a shop, bought something, tapped your card, and then walked out of the shop going, I wonder how much that cost. Like you've got a general sense, but you probably don't know because you just tapped and you didn't look at the receipt. And so you don't, but we're fortunate enough, again, been spending with cash, and we've got this good sense of how much different things cost because we had to give the cash out. Whereas sometimes kids will not have any idea really of that relative value of different pieces. So it's so important. And the other last bit on that is that we have these new cards for children. So you've got your like sort of Go Henry and Nimbler, etc., which are fantastic in terms of convenience, but they're essentially designed to make us spend more. Whenever we're going contactless, it's given off the impression that it's making our lives easier by convenience, but it's all been created so we do spend more. It's the less convenient, the more convenient is, the more likely we are to spend, and therefore the more money that the card companies are going to make. So we have to be a bit wary of that and making sure our kids, because I always think if I had a card when I was 7 years old with my name on it and a picture that I've chosen, I would want to go out and use it. I wouldn't want to just keep it in my wallet. But some parents see these apps and think that the children are going to learn through the app and become good with money. I'm very, very cautious about that. I generally feel that the apps and the direct debit cards or prepaid cards are essentially just a tool. And it's like giving a child a calculator doesn't mean they're going to be good with maths. But if you give them the education and the tool, then clearly the world's their oyster. And I think that's the same with this technology. If you teach them about money and teach them about the three rules of wealth, and you're doing the transaction piece, and then give them the tool, and then they can look at how much money they've got, see how much money they're saving, and they can do it real time. There's lots of benefits, but they need the education. The apps, etc., are definitely not a replacement for the education that we naturally got from using cash.
Well, that's such a insightful commentary. So talking about, I mean, again, it's a conversation that we started just before the webinar, but one thing that we get asked quite often is around investing for children. So this isn't necessarily the children understanding, we've got 10 seeds and we need to grow the forest. Therefore, these two we're going to choose ourselves to invest. This is more investments on behalf of children, and there's lots of different options. I mean, have you got kind of thoughts or preferences based on the conversations and what you've done with your children?
Yeah, so for our children, because I'm overseas, so we can't set up junior ISAs in the UK. So I've got an investment account where we invest in thousands of different companies. So just a global sort of tracker fund. And so we just kind of allocate a piece of our fund to our children. So they essentially own a piece of our fund. We've got a spreadsheet that allows us to do that. So then even if they want to put £1 of their pocket money towards their investment account, we can do that very easily without having to transfer money around. But again, that's because we don't have junior ISA option, because we're overseas. But I'd almost recommend that if parents want to start investing for their kids, that's not a bad way to start, because sometimes if they've only got like £10 pocket money or whatever it is, to start their own account. But if you have your own account, and then potentially, but as the money does get bigger, then having their own accounts and potentially having it in a junior ISA format, so they get all the tax benefits, so they don't pay any tax on any of the growth of that money, and it becomes their money when they're 18, and hopefully then they'll have learned about money, about investing. But I really do strongly recommend that parents do more research about investing, because children are young and it's about planting those seeds. And so again, on that analogy about planting and growing those trees, the sooner they plant those seeds, the more time they've got to grow. But also what happens when most adults start investing, as you'll probably know, that the first time they invest with a decent size of money, and then the first kind of shock to the stock market, they get really panicky and then they can potentially pull out and never really go back in. It's such an emotional experience for them, because it's their money and it's quite big. Whereas if you start investing for your kids, then they don't really have much option. You're just going to invest and it's going to stay with them, and it starts with a small amount. But if they see that money and you kind of talk to them about that investment over time, they'll see that there's going to be these bumps along the way, such that when they get to to becoming adults and they're going to invest for themselves, they won't feel that huge emotional scare factor when the stock market will crash inevitably at some point when they're later in life. So yeah, so I really recommend that parents do start to invest, even if it's the smallest amount for their kids, and just give them that time to grow. But in terms of why investing, I suppose, and how, so I invest for my kids, and my kids know about investing, and one of, as I mentioned, one of my early blogs got mentioned in the Financial Times, and it was actually about the story I shared about how I taught my kids about investing. And actually, as I mentioned, I'm in Hong Kong at this very moment in time. I was in McDonald's here in Hong Kong, and I actually said to my children, did you know that we actually own a piece of this McDonald's? Because, as I say, we invest in this global fund, so we invest in thousands of companies, and one of them is going to be McDonald's. And they're like, really? And I was like, yeah, but you own this. And they're like, well, we own this table, this bench, and I was like, yep, you own it, the bins, the doors, everything. And not just this McDonald's, but all of the McDonald's you've ever been to and all the McDonald's around the world, you own a piece of it. Clearly, I didn't go through exactly how small a bit they owned, but that didn't matter. They got really excited. And I was like, yep, and all those people who are queuing up for their Big Macs and their Happy Meals, they're going to give some money to McDonald's, and some of that money is going to be yours. And the more people spend at McDonald's, the more money you're going to get. And the reason that you own some is that every month my wife and I invest some money on their behalf, and that goes to McDonald's, and McDonald's uses that money to create new burgers or open new restaurants. And the more burgers and restaurants they have, the more money people are going to spend, and the more money McDonald's is going to get. And again, they could just see this kind of flow, and you could see in their minds. And it was nice that they can actually watch the money when the people were spending. And then we left there and we walked through the shopping mall, and we saw the Apple store. And again, we saw the people buying their iPads and their iPhones, and we're like, yep, you own a bit of Apple as well. And then because we live in Hong Kong, there's the Disney, and we have to go past that on the boat that we were going on. And we're like, yep, you own a bit of Disney as well. And they're like, wow, this concept of investing really got them excited because they own these companies that they know about. And so, yeah, it was quite making it real for them and putting it to life, made it very simple. And we didn't go into PE ratios and dividends and buyback. Didn't need to go into that. It was just a simple concept of, we give some money to these companies. That means you own them, and the more people spend their money at these companies. So as long as people keep spending and you own all the companies that people are spending at, that money's flowing from you to the company, and those companies are owned by people. And therefore, if you're one of those people, the money's going to flow to you. And so that worked out really well. And then the other piece is then they could see how these seeds are now starting to grow. These seeds that we talked about, right, that's how they grow into trees. But it also then helped into the other analogy, which is really powerful on this, is that when the stock market crashes, that's just like a storm coming and not breaking the trees. And so, and we all know that when a storm comes and a tree gets broken, we don't just chop it down. We just kind of let the tree grow back, and it always seems to grow back bigger and stronger. And that's exactly the kind of mindset that we have with managing our investments and our children. So my kids now know that if there's a shock in the stock market, I actually tell them, they're like, oh, it's a storm. And they don't worry about it. And in fact, what they actually see it as a bit of an opportunity at that time. So yeah, I super encourage parents to think about investing for their kids. I think it's just a huge advantage for them by the time they're 18. They would have the money saved up and invested, but they would have had that experience that, as we know, very few adults really understand the stock market or the concepts of it, and get very worried about when storms come along.
I think that's a great lesson. I think Andy Hart, who is kind of quite a leading voice in financial advice in the UK, I think he kind of coins the phrase, you're owning the greatest companies in the world. And I think that's just a much easier way of understanding, equities, stocks. It just sounds, it's harder to relate to than owning the greatest companies in the world. And I guess if you're in the mall, seeing Apple, seeing McDonald's, seeing the transactions, then it just all becomes more real. I think that the junior ISA, I guess one of the concerns that you might have in the UK is you can actually put quite a big amount of money in the junior ISA each year, £9,000 each year, potentially from age 0 to age 18. I guess going down that route, you kind of backing yourself to do a great job in terms of not just financial literacy, but also emotional resilience. So hopefully they continue that journey beyond 18. The other option, which I think is quite interesting to explore, obviously less exciting for your children at age 18, but it's the pension option. And there's some incredible numbers involved in that, just because you've got the much longer time horizon. I think Rob Gardner actually did a TEDx talk on this, just talking about, for not much more than the cost of a coffee each day, you can have something that just, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think it's a phenomenal amount of savings, because I say you're just giving so much time, and you've got all that tax benefits, and you get this sort of 20% tax rebate, so you're essentially free money, and your kids become like millionaires at 65. So I really like that, in the sense of what I like about that is when grandparents contribute to that. And I think if I was a grandparent, what a legacy. It's like, so by the time my grandchildren are 65, I'll be long gone, but then they're going to get this money and their 61st birthday from Grandpa Will, when he's around, and essentially using my retirement to sort of fund their retirement. So I like that concept. But in terms of the ISA versus the pension, I think there's a kind of a balancing act, because clearly, especially in the world today where education is so expensive, first properties are so expensive, the kind of utility of those and having some money to do that, versus actually you've got this money but you can't have it for another 40 years, 45 years. So again, I think that's just a values. Parents need to think about what they want to do with that, but both are fantastic options. But the one about the junior ISA, which is really interesting, is why a lot of parents don't use like the ISA. As you mentioned, you can put quite a lot of money in there. And if parents do, and then you get this 18-year-old, and it automatically becomes the child's money. They can do whatever they like with that money at 18. And so parents are like, right, what was I doing when I was 18? Oh dear. And if I had this big pool of money at that time, what would I? And it's a very real risk. And I've heard some stories of children getting, so one grandmother gave her grandson, I don't know, it must have been £5,000 on his 18th birthday. And so it's quite a lot of her money savings wise, but she wanted to transfer that wealth. And he spent £4,000 on gold teeth. And so you can imagine that is not what she wanted with her hard-earned savings. And so it's a very real risk. And the key way in which I try and talk to parents or grandparents or whoever's transferring wealth is, if you're going to transfer wealth, let them know about it early and make sure they've got plans for it early. And you want to avoid the risk where the money becomes to them in a spontaneous manner, because if it becomes spontaneous to them, so on their 18th, they're just going to feel like a lottery winner. And we know all the stories about lottery winners. They get their money, they haven't had any training, not planned about it, and they can go out and they lose most of their money relatively quickly. And so we want to avoid that. So having children, and even my daughters are 8 and 10, and we've got some saying we don't go anywhere near the sort of 9,000 a year limit. My kind of personal view is I don't want my kids to have, I want them to have some money, but not crazy amount of money, because of just different reasons, but having some money. But we also need to talk about what do they want to do with that money. Again, their plans might change as they get older and their preferences change, because clearly when they're 8 and 10, they don't really have concept, but they're starting to think about it. But as they get older, their plans will change, but such to the point that when they are 18, they know what they're going to do with the money before it turns up. And therefore it's not just going to be a case of random shopping spree, but they're probably going to think about, maybe it is for a first car, maybe it is for an apartment or wherever it may be, or a year off holiday, whatever it may be. At least it's more conscious spending rather than this, here's the money. Or then you get into, the alternative is you don't do that and you just say, well, I'm going to keep the money in my account, and I'll only give them the money when they're responsible and they show they're responsible. But again, you don't know what that time is, and if when you do give that money, it's still going to be spontaneous for them, and they're still going to, regardless of their age, they're probably still going to spend it in a largely spontaneous way, which again doesn't really achieve what you're trying to achieve. So I think it's more about planning for that money when they're older.
Yeah, it's really interesting you say that, Will, and I suppose what we've spoken about is kind of two different sides of the equation. One is, okay, how do you invest and help your children build wealth themselves and through your help over time, but it's also how do you get those behaviors right? And I suppose to answer what is the right way of saving and investing for your children, I think to part of the answer is yes, what it's for, but it's also, okay, have you educated them in the way? So then if they do have a junior ISA and they are in receipt of a number of thousands of pounds, if not tens of thousands of pounds at 18, have you as their parent or grandparent helped educate them around the finances? Almost, you kind of can merge both together. It's partly behavior and partly the actual vehicle to help them build and create that wealth. And I suppose that's where the book comes in, and all of the really good work around financial education is so important.
Yeah, so it's almost my kind of view is that the education piece is actually more valuable than the money that you transfer. And so you mentioned the podcast. My second podcast was about the Vanderbilt family, and they were once the richest family, one of the richest families ever. But and so in the late 90s, they had
in Asheville.
Yeah, and they had all this money, but then the sort of patriarch of the family sort of died and passed on all his wealth to the next generation, and it just didn't last. And within sort of 2-3 generations, most of the money disappeared because they just spent it and they didn't know how to look after it. And compared to other families who have much less money, but they've taught their kids about it, and the money's gone on for generation after generation, and will probably last for many, many more generations because they've looked after that money, set up trusts and education to make sure that money is there for many, many generations to come.
I mean, I guess linked to that. So I think we've spent quite a lot of time talking about the 3 rules of wealth, helping children develop good habits and working on their financial literacy. What about the emotional resilience side of things? I think one of the things we talked about again just before the call was how often in society we can mistake self-worth and net worth.
Yeah, no, it's a really important piece for children to understand, and a lot of that goes back to this kind of rich versus wealthy, and it takes a lot of emotional control to not do what everyone else is doing. And I think this is something that we need to it's not just going to be one of these lessons that you say once and suddenly they're going, oh, I know the difference between rich and wealthy. Oh, I want to be wealthy and therefore all's good in the rest of their lives. It's going to be this constant conversations that we need to have and reinforcements about, okay, why are your friends spending this, or why do you care about your friends having this and you don't, or why do you think that our family doesn't have chosen to spend our money here and not over there? And the more that they can start to answer these questions and be more comfortable with it, the less likely they're going to be very reactionary. And I think as we know, money is so emotionally driven, as you mentioned about, I can't remember who you mentioned, but earlier, but the whole, if everyone did followed the rules of wealth, everyone would be rich and followed the knowledge, but it's so emotional. And it's a case of, that's why we need to have these conversations to make sure our kids are emotionally robust, to not overcome the urges and the pressures that we all face every day about money, whether that's, even if it's not spending, it's should I be doing Bitcoin versus investing in the stock market, because I hear all these stories and I know people are telling me about, I can make so much more money in this, why am I doing the boring strategy? Which I know long term. And so even for myself, I have to kind of go through those kind of emotions, but the more that you do it, the easier it becomes. And I think, again, if we can get our kids understanding that there are these pressures, because the more, again, if you bring it to light, the more likely they are to understand and ask questions to do that, which comes on to another point around money. And talking to children about money not only helps them in this knowledge side and their habits and their emotions, but it also takes away this taboo status that we have around money. And there's so many people are in financial stress as adults today, and they don't talk to anyone about it. And it's almost like they're afraid to go and seek help, because if you go and seek help, then someone might find out that you've sought some help, and therefore they know that you're in trouble, and so I'd rather not tell anyone. And then that just compounds and compounds. And so if we can get children talking to our children about money, less it's going to become a taboo. And there's kind of been some good studies on this that show that even if you don't talk about money in a negative way, the fact that you don't talk about money, kids will assume that it's negative. And it's a bit like swearing. It's most times, hopefully parents aren't swearing around their kids, but kids will know from the absence of swearing, because they'll know about what swearing is, but they'll know by the absence of swearing that it's a bad thing. And they know their parents don't do it, therefore it must be bad. Oh, my parents don't talk about money, therefore it must be bad. And so we need to have these positive conversations about money from an early age. They're more likely then to ask questions, they're more likely to be intrigued, and more likely then hopefully to ask for help when needed. Again, overcome any kind of emotional hurdles that they might face.
I think that idea around, I mean, I guess you might consider it shame is such an interesting one. I think you shared an anecdote from your professional life just before the call in terms of the subscription for different education topics that you'd set up in the workplace. Can you just share that story?
Yeah, sure. So I do some workshops with large corporates where I go in and do an hour with a presentation to talk how, essentially the same title as this, how to teach your kids about money. But when I was talking to the lady from the company, and she said, oh, we had a financial well-being course 1 month earlier by a different company, but the attendance for the one about kids was much, much higher. And so she wanted to understand why, because she wanted to put the agenda forward for future workshops. And she found out that lots of people wanted to attend the adult webinar or workshop that was being hosted by this other company, but they didn't want people to know that they were attending that, especially because they were working for a financial services company. They didn't want people to say, well, why is Joe over there going to that workshop? Surely they should know about money because they're helping other people look after their money. And actually I've worked in the financial services industry for many, many years, and lots of them still don't manage their own money very sensibly. Okay. And some of that's just because they earn good money, so they don't think about money. I'll just earn some more, that kind of mentality. But then it's like Richie Raccoon in the book, that only works until it doesn't work. And then it all falls apart, but also it means that they miss out on opportunities. So yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic. Whereas my workshop about teaching kids about money, it's helping people learn about money in a way in which they're not getting judged, except for you're helping your kids learn about money. That's a positive. There's no kind of self-reflection. So it's kind of being able to teach them in the one step removed, which is a really interesting kind of insight, which I didn't think about. But actually, the more I do think about that, it's a huge challenge. And again, the more we can talk to kids about money, the hopefully less that's going to be in the future. But also the more we think about kids, and I think, as you mentioned, our pre-call chat, that when parents do start teaching their kids about money, the parents start to role model good behaviors, and they start to think about, right, what am I doing with my savings? Am I saving some money? How am I being a conscious spender, and thinking about being wealthy rather than being rich? So yeah, there's a lot of positive dynamics that hopefully will overcome some of the challenges that many people are facing as adults today.
It's so insightful. So I just want to open up. I think we've got people on the call. Hopefully we'll get some questions coming through from either the chat or the Q&A function. While we're waiting for those to come through, I think it's worth mentioning that we are recording this webinar, so we'll make a password encrypted recording available, so people can refer to it and can also share it with friends and family. And as we share that, we'll also share a link with your blog, if that's okay, Will, and also a link to enable more people to buy the book, which I'm a huge supporter of. My children are a little younger, actually. They're 3 and 5, but my 5-year-old is enjoying the stories, and I know it's aimed for it's 8 to 13, isn't it? The kind of
so about six to 13 to read on their own. But as you mentioned, my youngest was about 4 years old when I started to share some of the stories. And again, I call it fables because it's a bit like the Aesop's fables. When you're very young, you probably enjoy the boy who cried wolf story, but you probably don't really understand the kind of message behind it. But you remember the story, but then as you get older, you then put the kind of meaning to the story, and it then sticks with you for days to come. And I think that's the same thing with the book. It's children hopefully like the stories, and then as they get older and remember or reread the stories, then it'll all kind of piece together.
All right, I have got a couple questions here, actually. So there's one which is how do you reward good behavior with children around finances?
All right, interesting. So in terms of the interpretation of the question, there's should you give financial reward for good behavior? So there's 2 angles to it. So I'll go for the first one, which is, should you use money to reward good behavior? My kind of view is no. We don't, just because it has then the negative impact. If they misbehave and you don't, then they miss out on their pocket money. They're going to have a negative view around money. They're going to be like, oh, I don't want to have that money. Money's bad because I get punished and I lose the money. And you want kids to be thinking very positively around money. So I try and avoid that and try and think of other ways in which behavior can be reinforced or stumped out, depending on the good or bad behaviors, without using financial rewards. And again, there might be some short-term incentives so I know for like big exams, etc., you might want to give an extra boost with a little bit of money, but we don't do that just in case they don't get the exams and it's like a double whammy that they don't get the grades that they want, and they don't get the financial reward as well. So, but I think that's on a family by family, but our kind of view is trying not to link money to those kind of behaviors just because it can have that negative. The flip way of perceiving that question, which might be, is so you've got, do you reward good behaviors? What about if children are showing good behaviors with their money? So for example, they are saving, do you reward that? And I think that's a really important one, because one of the third rules I mentioned was about being patient. And being patient in the long term as adults, we know has huge rewards. But for children, how do they know that being patient has a reward? And you can't get them to wait years. So for my kids, and what I encourage others is, if my children do save, so if they put some money into their sort of savings pot, I do give them a little reward for doing so. Maybe after a week, I give them a little bit of interest on that. Again, just so they can see that by being patient and by saving, it is rewarded. And then as they get older, then I'll sort of spread out how often I give that reward. But again, the sort of good behaviors in terms of money, I try and reinforce where possible.
So there's a few more questions come in. I think we've picked this one up, actually. So this was, how would you explain the risk of investing generally to children so they won't be fearful of making losses? I think that's the storm analogy, right, Will?
Yeah, no, it is. And so just to add on to that a little bit, so because then you can try and use real world examples helps as well. So again, using the McDonald's example with my kids, we talked about when COVID first hit, the stock market went down, and we were saying, well, everyone's kind of locked up at home. They're not going out and buying their burgers. Because remember, when they first heard about McDonald's, they saw the money going to McDonald's. And we're like, well, those people aren't going and giving that money to McDonald's. So, but don't worry, as soon as hopefully the COVID has sorted itself out, people will go back to spending their money. And again, they could see, okay, that's what's going to happen. And it's kind of what did. Clearly not all financial examples of the stock market are that transparent and clear. But where there are examples, trying to use some of those really helps. And the other piece is about investing in lots of companies. So I used this example where I had like 10 blocks of Lego. And I said, right, each block is one company. And every now and then there'll be a company that goes bust. So we used Blockbuster Video, which made me feel really old because we had to explain what a video cassette was. And we had to tell them what Blockbuster, we had to go to this like library and get these boxes and put them in our TV. But anyway, we sort of said because of Netflix, essentially, no one went to Blockbuster anymore. So we took one of the Lego bricks and kind of threw it away. And then we got another one and said, like, this is like Kodak, and explained about photography and threw that one. So they had 10 bricks and now they've only got 8. But we said out of those 8 blocks that are left, they've all grown. They're still doing really well. So you can imagine one of these blocks being Netflix, and you can add on a few extra blocks on top. And again, you had this one, which was like Facebook or Apple, and you add in on these. So even though they lost those 2 companies, they're seeing these blocks, and there's more than 10 blocks at the end of it. And again, it was just a nice little visual to show that even if, as long as you have lots of companies there, you have lots of blocks, even if some of them go from 1 to 0, as long as there's some companies that are going to go from 1 to 10 or whatever it may be, because you own all of them pretty much, or thousands of them, low cost, just shows that the risk is not as bad as if you just look at one company. If you just looked at Blockbuster, the whole stock market looks very scary. But if you look in the context of actually, well, Blockbuster did go, but Netflix did really well, and Apple's did really well, and all these other companies do really well. It puts that kind of risk in perspective. So
the storm hitting the forest, and also the diversification by showing different Lego blocks. So we've got a few more questions coming. I'm just conscious of time, so we're going to have to go quite quickly through these ones.
Okay.
So is the junior ISA something that children can start investing in for themselves? If not, is there another vehicle you would recommend?
Yeah, no, children can transfer their money to a junior ISA. So it's not as easy as it should be, but children can put their money into a junior ISA and see that money grow themselves. So parents can contribute. Most people can transfer money into that junior account once it's set up. I don't have any particular ways, because I say I don't have a UK account at the moment, so I can't recommend any, or even from a guidance point of view, any specifics around vehicles. But most of the large asset managers, so the likes of Vanguard and BlackRock, etc., and I'm sure Paul and colleagues can help find appropriate vehicles.
Yeah, absolutely, we can. So I guess it's something that so it's a vehicle with tax benefits, and as children are saving 2 seeds, that's something that they can contribute their own seeds to. So they're starting to get that investing habit. Yes. All right, one more really quickly. So children gravitate towards ethical conduct. So I guess we're more conscious of the planet that we're living in, recycling, saving the planet, etc. Have you got any thoughts around ethical investing and teaching children around ESG funds?
Oh, fantastic question. Yeah, no, 100% that there are now these funds, again, big and small funds, that essentially have a screening on them to try and screen out companies that are not very friendly towards either people or the planet. So for example, actually my daughters, we have a sort of global index fund that actually is what's called ESG fund. So again, it just has a screening on there. So it takes out tobacco companies, it takes out companies with weapons, or companies with any kind of links to certain sanctioned kind of countries, just to give that kind of screening. Some can go even further, which we don't go, which are like very proactive. So they only invest in companies that are being proactive to making the world a better place. Again, the amount of companies that they invest in becomes smaller. So whilst it's doing good for the world, it's potentially a bit more risky from an investment point of view. But again, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's just about getting that balance of views. But for my daughters, they get a lot of pride in the sense that then they're avoiding the companies that they see as bad companies, which are the non-ESG friendly companies.
So two last questions, and then we'll wrap up. So there's one around age. So is there an age when you think teens and adults should invest? I guess that's from the perspective of for themselves.
Yeah. So I started talking to my daughters. So I can start term investing for them as young as possible, and then from about the age of 7 is when my eldest daughter kind of got that very simple concept of investing in what is investing in terms of the McDonald's story that I shared earlier. But even before that, like my 4-year-old got the concept of trees growing, and she wants to have this forest and wants to see her money growing. So I think there's the younger the better. And say from 4 years old, I think they can get the money can grow, and that's by investing. Then what is investing in terms of the education? So investing for themselves, if you can help them set up the account so they can transfer some of their money even from that youngest age and seeing that grow. And again, the younger they are and they get into that habit of saving a little bit and then putting some money into that investment account, even if they kind of save up a little bit and it's only transferred once a year into their investment account, because they might not have too much to transfer, the better. But yeah, the young as 4 if you can, but in terms of education, probably around 7.
Brilliant. And I guess 7 is that's from the Cambridge University research, which shows that's the age where the habits are set. So one last question, which is quite a broad one, but hopefully we can wrap it up reasonably quickly. And it's any tips for beginning to introduce these conversations with children for the first time?
Yeah, so I'd go with the seed analogy. It's been the most powerful one. So getting your children to think about seeds and this growing, because it makes it fun. It makes it less boring, I suppose, in terms of the concept, and they can then start visualizing and start asking some really interesting questions about, what does it mean about the seeds? What are the seeds? And you can talk about compound interest, dividends, all this stuff that's not overly complex once you put it into that kind of framework. But again, depends on the age of the children. So anything under 13, that kind of works. Then if they're older than that, then I'd start the conversation about the rich versus wealthy kind of bit, and sharing some stories that you might have heard of famous people who had lots of money that lost it because they kept spending. So don't get too bogged down or too fixated on what people are spending when it comes to money. It's more about how they're looking after that money. So that's the biggest topic at that age. And again, using real world examples. Podcast has a few that they can listen to.
Well, exactly. I mean, I was going to just suggest that. So, people trying to introduce these concepts for the first time, like there's resources which include your fantastic book, Grandpa's Fortune Fables. It's interesting that you're talking about grow money. I think the resource I used for my younger children was Rob Gardner's book, Grow Your Acorns, which is
great book.
Like exactly along the same lines. And also the podcast, so the podcast, like I've enjoyed some lessons from. And they're real world stories, and I think you do a really nice job bringing them to life, and that's the lessons that ultimately you want people to, that you want your children to take on and develop their own good habits and their own good values around it.
Yeah.
Well, listen, Will, we're 3 minutes over, but I think all the attendees have stayed right the way through, which I think is a testament to A, the importance of the topic, but also B, your level of engagement in terms of like the enthusiasm and knowledge that you're able to pass on. So thank you again for your time today. Really appreciate it. Hope you enjoy the rest of your evening in Hong Kong. And for anyone who's still listening, we'll make a recording of this available, and we'll also link to your website and a link to the book as well. So thanks again, Will. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you very much. Speak again soon.
Thanks. Take care.